What we are watching right now is an almost absurdly counterintuitive technological inflection point. The smoke over the Persian Gulf did not trigger the oil shock everyone was waiting for, but instead set off a survival-driven great industrial divergence, where nations are now accelerating into asymmetric evolution races, each taking radically different routes and moving at radically different speeds. As the two economies with the largest energy appetites on paper, the United States and China have not shown the expected signs of scarcity. Instead, they are positioning themselves to convert what could become massive future energy surpluses into the computational backbone for AI. Meanwhile, countries trapped by the geographic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, like Japan and India, are not simply sprinting toward renewables the way the public imagines. They are being forced into an evolutionary path toward alternative energy forms that look nothing like the mainstream green transition narrative. Even more counterintuitive is the European Union, sitting on the edge of both the Ukraine war and the Middle East crisis, because while paying some of the most crushing costs in the developed world, it has neither chosen to simply expand imports nor to rely on conventional renewable expansion, but has instead launched an energy strategy so aggressive that it goes far beyond what traditional experts considered plausible. In essence, the EU is attempting to compress an entire technological generational leap into an extremely narrow time window, pouring several trillion euros into skipping the chemical plus electricity hybrid architecture currently used by both the US and China, and forcibly pushing European industry into a fully electrified era. A lot of people obsess over day-to-day oil prices, and they look at shale producers in the United States with a kind of envy, thinking America is simply getting rich off a temporary shale windfall. But for serious players, America's real strategic payoff is not sitting in the profits of shale oil, but buried inside the very natural curse of shale that people have spent the last decade complaining about. Unlike conventional Middle Eastern fields where you punch a hole in the ground and the reservoir can keep flowing for decades, shale wells decline brutally fast, sometimes dropping by 70% in the first year alone. And that harsh mathematical reality effectively forces shale oil to stop behaving like slow-moving extraction and start behaving like high-tech manufacturing, because it becomes extremely interest rate sensitive, unusually financially elastic, and capable of a pace of iteration that most heavy industries simply cannot match. That interest rate sensitivity traps private American producers in a permanent drill or die debt spiral, where stopping new drilling is not playing it safe, but essentially signing your own death warrant. Debt pressure then forces companies to expand output and slash costs continuously, and over time this mechanism has evolved into a brutal technology arms race among thousands of competing firms. The speed of iteration is almost shocking, whether it is ultra-long horizontal drilling that stretches for kilometers underground, electric fracking fleets that abandon diesel entirely, or AI systems that read formation data in real time to optimize well placement. Once a technique is proven, it can be rolled out across the next wave of wells within months. So while many oil-producing countries are still running the same playbook they used 10 years ago, shale producers in the United States have quietly achieved a nearly 300% leap in per-well production performance over the last decade. And then came the real twist, when that high-speed technological machine collided with America's unusually favorable geology. A global headache that has haunted every energy transition plan on Earth. Long-duration storage suddenly found a low-cost workaround almost by accident. Shale basins often come with salt formations, and for decades the associated gas around these wells was treated as an inefficient byproduct, something to flare, discount, or simply tolerate. But once you upgrade the technology stack, that gas can be turned into hydrogen on site, and the hydrogen can be injected straight into nearby salt caverns, transforming what used to be a geological sunk cost into geologic-scale energy storage that can undercut lithium-based systems by orders of magnitude in cost. At the same time, America's financial elasticity adds another hidden lever. Thousands of drilled but uncompleted wells, plus a capital market that is always keen to surge production, together create a shadow mechanism that dampens global oil price volatility. Connecting these fragments reveals a new energy geometry. Nuclear power anchors the baseload, shale gas provides fast-ramping flexibility, edge AI data centers cluster at energy nodes, and hydrogen salt caverns enable cheap, long-duration storage. The real killer feature is that it makes energy behave less like fixed infrastructure and more like a semi-tradable financial instrument. Shale's high decline rates and rapid iteration cycles partially compress trillion-dollar grid constraints and multi-decade build-out timelines into modular, localized engineering loops, which in the US can then be priced, scaled, and rebalanced through capital markets, turning part of the energy problem into a short-cycle, high-frequency financial coordination problem. So what does that actually mean? It means that in the post-oil era, while every other industrial region is forced to pour massive capital into grid hardening and into fighting over expensive lithium supply chains just to secure energy stability, the United States can free up trillions of dollars through shale-driven full-stack energy closure and redirect that capital straight into AI chips, algorithms, and data centers. Looking back, the United States almost accidentally used the shale sector's fragile debt leverage to convert what is a long-cycle physical bottleneck for other economies into a short-cycle capital allocation problem for itself. And that is where the hidden strategic dividend finally becomes visible. This high-frequency, financialized energy system can, under strong capital cycles or low-interest rate environments, quietly subsidize America's next-generation AI industrial build-out, creating a rare layer of certainty in the global race for computational dominance. If America's counterintuitive story comes from our blind spots about new technology, then China's counterintuitive story comes from something more dangerous: path dependence on outdated assumptions. For years, strategic analysts around the world have repeated the same mental model. China is the world's largest crude importer, so if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, China faces industrial paralysis and social instability. But that entire narrative is built on an obsolete premise, that China is still a traditional industrial economy powered primarily by internal combustion engines. The data points to a different reality. China has effectively evolved into a full-stack electricity economy supported by coal, hydropower, wind, solar, and nuclear, where Persian Gulf crude accounts for only around 4% of total energy supply. And for a country with massive domestic coal reserves, losing a slice that small is not an existential shock to the energy system. Even the public's obsession with gasoline shortages is often overstated, because while Persian Gulf oil makes up over 30% of China's imports, outsiders tend to miss something uniquely Chinese: excess rail capacity. China has built the densest high-speed rail and urban rail network on the planet, with lines that extend deep into the capillaries of major cities. And in extreme scenarios, this fully electrified transportation backbone allows for the extreme compression of civilian gasoline usage to provide a strategic buffer for industrial circulation in a way that car countries simply cannot replicate. Of course, a straight crisis could also accelerate China's substitution process, because the real oil sink is not private cars, but heavy trucks, where one heavy-duty truck can burn as much fuel in a year as roughly 30 passenger vehicles. That is why policies targeting hydrogen-powered heavy trucks, scheduled to take effect in March 2026, matter so much. Because if hydrogen substitution scales across freight fleets within a few years, that single shift could offset the equivalent of half the transport shock created by Persian Gulf volatility. Add to that the continuing electrification of passenger cars, and within a few years, oil stops being a strategic fuel and quietly degrades into something closer to an industrial consumable. Yes, a constrained strait would still hit China's logistics chains, but China also has a pressure relief valve that most countries lack: the China-Europe Railway Express, a land-based redundancy that can partially substitute when maritime choke points tighten. Decades of infrastructure investment have effectively moved China from the center of the storm to the edge, giving it enough strategic distance to step away from today's resource conflict and redirect surplus energy toward the next-generation race for AI compute. Europe's most counterintuitive number is not a percentage, not a headline inflation figure, but 660 billion euros every single year. Because according to the European Commission's own estimates, hitting its energy transition targets will require spending more than 6 trillion euros over a 10-year window. Unlike energy-rich powers like the United States or Russia, Europe is structurally an energy-importing bloc, and its system is now being forced to transform at its most fragile moment while simultaneously colliding head-on with two crises, one in the north and one in the south. In other words, pipeline dependency risk has not been fully eliminated, and on top of that, Europe has inherited a second layer of exposure: energy shipping risk. Right now, Europe's most urgent task is to replace liquefied natural gas. But the problem is that the supply side is already running into hard physical ceilings. Norway is effectively at its production limit. And while the United States has abundant gas reserves, its liquefaction capacity is constrained by infrastructure rigidity, meaning exports cannot scale up instantly no matter how high the price goes. And once India, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asian buyers entered the competition for the same molecules, Europe's procurement costs were mechanically pushed upward. So the path of simply importing more energy has been largely blocked. Most people assume the European Union will replace imports by building more nuclear and more solar, but the reality is sharply different from that expectation. Europe's real bet is that squeezing efficiency to the absolute limit may be more feasible than trying to brute force its way into vastly higher green supply. That is why, out of those 600+ billion euros of annual investment, the majority of the capital is being poured into what may be the largest end-use electrification retrofit campaign in modern history. And the core of that program is not just adding insulation to old buildings, but forcing tens of thousands of factories through a deep technological rewrite, ripping out heat systems built around molecular combustion, like natural gas, and replacing them with industrial processes built around electron flow, meaning electric heat. In practice, that means steel plants abandoning blast furnaces in favor of electric arc furnaces, and chemical plants electrifying boilers and industrial heat entirely. The balance of that annual spending remains to be channeled into grid expansion and the development of an energy storage system capable of rivaling or even eclipsing that of the US. Consequently, even if full electrification slashes total primary energy consumption by more than half, effectively automating decarbonization despite a 20% spike in final electricity demand, the staggering capital requirements for end-use retrofits and storage infrastructure will inevitably drive up Europe's industrial cost base. If other economies continue operating on high shares of direct fossil fuel combustion, Europe will lose ground in competitiveness, which is why it needs a second layer of protection: the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, essentially a carbon tariff that forces imported goods to reflect the cost structure of green industrial production. Even then, if the rest of the world refuses to treat electrification as the entry ticket for future trade rules, Europe can at best protect its internal market from being undercut, rather than exporting its model outward. However, Europe is still holding one more card. Today, roughly 70% of global industrial energy still relies on chemical energy, specifically combustion. If Europe becomes the first region to fully eliminate combustion from its industrial base, it can then leverage AI to push energy management into an extreme efficiency regime. A fully electrified factory can become flexible in a way combustion-based industry never could, capable of shutting down and restarting in response to grid conditions, not in days, but in minutes, and eventually in real time. Under millisecond-level AI dispatch, these factories gain a strange new superpower: energy arbitrage, because they can ramp up redundant capacity during periods when electricity prices collapse towards zero or even go negative, and then throttle down or pause production during expensive peak hours. Which means Europe's 10-year, €6 trillion bet is not only about decarbonization, but about a future where the spread created by AI-optimized electricity price. Differentials could be large enough to offset the depreciation and efficiency losses caused by stop-start industrial operation. Japan, India, and much of Southeast Asia sit directly inside the overlap zone between the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea shipping corridor, and they are now being pushed into an industrial divergence that is dictated by pure physical geography. Japan's position is constrained by a combination of rigid physical limitations, limited land, narrow shallow coasts, and an energy profile that simply cannot scale solar or wind to industrial levels. And as an island nation, Japan cannot rely on cross-border pipelines to lock in stable baseload supply, which means it has to solve the problem in a way that continental powers never have to consider. That is why Japan has been pouring resources into two bets at once: a nuclear revival at home and ammonia shipping routes abroad. The logic is brutally pragmatic: build hydrogen production hubs inside resource-rich countries, convert hydrogen into liquid ammonia because ammonia is chemically stable and far easier to transport, and then use Japan's massive ocean-going fleet to construct a liquid energy supply chain that stretches across thousands of miles. In a deeper sense, this is not just an energy strategy. It is the externalization of energy production itself, where Japan's future industrial survival depends on relocating the upstream part of its energy system beyond its own territory. India faces a similar structural constraint because, despite being a continental power, the Himalayas act as a physical wall that prevents India from achieving large-scale pipeline integration with Eurasia. But India also has something Japan does not: vast territory and some of the highest solar irradiation on the planet, which gives it room to pursue a different kind of dual-track evolution. On one track, India is leaning on coal gasification as a foundational layer of supply security, essentially turning domestic coal into a more flexible industrial fuel base. On the second track, it is gradually shifting energy-intensive sectors like steel and chemicals away from the interior and toward the southern coastal belt, where solar output is higher and where industrial clusters can plug directly into localized energy generation. In essence, India is trying to skip the traditional dependence on a unified national grid by building islands of industrial electrification, regional systems that evolve independently instead of waiting for nationwide infrastructure to catch up. Southeast Asia, meanwhile, is taking advantage of a different kind of geography because the Pan-Asia Railway and regional connectivity projects give it a pathway to support cross-border logistics and gradually integrate its power system with the broader Asian mainland. That evolutionary path effectively turns Southeast Asia into the downstream terminal of the continental energy system, absorbing energy, capital, and industrial spillover from the larger Asian core. Before the smoke over the Strait of Hormuz ever rose, most people probably never realized that global industrial civilization had already fractured into so many radically different evolutionary paths: energy financialization, energy infrastructure expansion, energy technological acceleration, and under survival pressure, energy externalization, industrial islands, and energy dependence. These choices are buried deep inside geography and technology, invisible in ordinary times, because in stable eras the system has no reason to reveal its hidden constraints. Only when real crises arrive, when geopolitical choke points tighten to their maximum pressure, do we finally see what each nation is truly optimizing for, and what ultimate trade-offs it is willing to make based on its geographic gifts and its technological cards. And this asymmetric great industrial divergence is not reaching its conclusion. It is only just beginning.